Okay, we're going to get started. This is the Baltimore City Council's Ways and Means Committee. We're here today for 3 hearings. We're going to start out with Legislative Oversight 21-0003. This is a quarterly budget briefing. For that, we are going to have Bob Seneme from the Bureau of Budget and Management Research. After that, we will get into 2 other bills, which will essentially be the overview for the fiscal year 2022 budget. One of those deals with the ordinance of estimates. Bob will be presenting on behalf of the administration. We'll have the second bill being the operating budget for city schools. We will have Chief of Staff Allison Perkins Cohen, as well as their CFO. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I am Councilman Eric Costello, 11th District, Chair of the committee. I am joined by my colleagues on the committee, Councilwoman Danny McCray, 2nd District, Councilman Ryan Dorsey, 3rd District, Councilman Isaac Yitzi Schleifer, 5th District, Councilwoman and Vice President of the Council, Sharon Middleton, 6th District, Councilman Chris Burnett, 8th District, and Councilman Robert Stokes, 12th District. Also joining us is Councilwoman Odette Ramos from the 14th District, Councilwoman Felicia Porter from the 10th District, Councilman John Bullock from the 9th District, Councilman Mark Conway from the 4th District, and that is everyone on the council. Representing Mayor Brandon Scott is Melissa. Representing Council President Nick Mosby is Matt Stegman and Nikki Thompson. Bob, I'm going to ask you to keep your presentation on Q3 to somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 minutes, and then we will jump into questions. Before you begin, as a reminder to my colleagues, we will have a fiscal year 21 fourth quarter. So that's the quarter that goes from April 1st until June 30th of this year. We will have an overview of that. And Bob, I think we'll be ready to do that in mid to late August, if I'm not mistaken, once you've got the books completely closed for fiscal year 21. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Usually late August, early September.
Okay. Okay. We can wait until September. But colleagues, will be getting into much more detail in terms of what happened in fiscal 21 in early September. So with that, Bob, please take it away.
Okay, thank you, Councilman Costello and members of the committee. If you could, I don't have the access to share, so Marguerite, if you're on there, if you could give me that access, please.
You should have it.
Got it, thanks. And let me know when you can see the presentation.
We're good.
Good to go. Okay. So we will go ahead and get started. So thank you again. My name is Bob Seneme, Budget Director, representing the Department of Finance. And today we're first going to present an update on the fiscal 21 third quarter projection. This is the year we're currently in. And the agenda for today is first to look at the overall picture, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail on both the revenue and expenditure side, and also how federal aid is assisting us in fiscal 21. Just a warning before we get into this, there are some ugly numbers here, but we do have a plan to get to balance. You know, as I've been warning and mentioning over and over again, this is a really tough year due to COVID. And so we'll get into the details, but this is, you know, I can say right up front, this is one of the most challenging fiscal years we've faced in easily a decade and maybe even longer. So first things first, let's just jump right into the projection. So I first want to show you what the third quarter would look like without federal aid. And I should say up front, by third quarter, this is based on data through the third quarter. It includes a projection of what we think will happen in April, May, and June. So without any federal aid, we would be showing, as of the third quarter projection, $142.7 million general fund deficit. And the two reasons for that are, first, our revenue, as you can see on the first line, is $20 million below even our fiscal 21 budget estimate, which was, we felt, very conservative and very pessimistic based on what we knew was coming with COVID. We also, you can see on the bottom, have spending that's projected well over the budgeted amount. We did expect some of that spending because if you remember in the adopted budget, we didn't include anything for CARES Act or FEMA. We didn't include any appropriation for ARPA. We didn't even know ARPA would be here at that point. And so we did expect there to be some overspending due to COVID response. And I'll show you in a moment how we plan to resolve that. So if you look at this with federal aid, if you take that $142.7 million shortfall and then add back in help from the CARES Act of $57.6 million, if you add back in $34.1 million of FEMA reimbursement, which we expect to come through this year, and then if you add back in $51 million of ARPA funds, that would allow us to come to balance in fiscal 21. We are required, I want to remind folks, to be balanced in the general fund as a whole by law, and we are required to be balanced on an agency basis as well, which I'll touch on a little bit later. So that's kind of the kind of eye-opening first look. I want to first just kind of shift over and talk about revenue in more detail, then we'll come back to the federal aid specifically. So revenue summary, again, remember in the fiscal 21 budget, we released a preliminary budget before COVID was really a threat. And then between the preliminary budget and the final budget that was released, when COVID became an immediate threat, we actually wrote down our revenue forecast by over $100 million to reflect what we thought would be a really tough first and second quarter of fiscal 21. What we know now is that the pandemic has lasted even longer than that, so it really hit us for the full fiscal year. And so that's why our third quarter projection shows revenue down over $20 million, even beyond that pessimistic estimate. And in summary, what I can say is that the revenue sources that we thought would be directly impacted have suffered even more than we originally thought. So we'll touch on some of those in a moment. There are a handful of revenue sources that we thought would be hurt that haven't been affected so far, but the ones that were really affected were really acutely affected, as you'll see in a moment. So two of those revenue sources that are in really bad shape are first is parking. And so this is a chart showing you going back to fiscal 2016 and also showing you fiscal 20 broken down pre and post COVID, and then the sum of everything in fiscal 21. You'll notice that this is monthly parking revenue, average of monthly parking revenue based on the four key sources: parking tax, parking meters, garage income, and fines and penalties. And what you can see is pre-COVID, we were bringing in, on average, over $7 million of parking revenue per month, which equates to gross revenue of over $88 million. In fiscal 21 so far, we're averaging only $3.1 million per month. That equates to only $37.2 million annually from those revenue sources. That's a decline of $50 million in gross revenue just year over year. So just to give you a sense of what we're dealing with on that side. And then the same is true to a little bit of a lesser degree on the hotel tax side. You can see, again, monthly average hotel tax. Before COVID, we would average for those 5 years prior, upper $2, lower $3 million of hotel tax receipts per month. We're down in fiscal 21 so far. We've averaged less than $1 million per month of hotel tax collections. And you can see the occupancy rate in city hotels is way lower. We have seen the occupancy rate come up a bit in fiscal 2021, but the businesses have had to slash their prices to get people in the door. So net, we're really not bringing in that much more revenue, even with that slightly higher occupancy rate so far in 21. Looking at revenues as a whole across the budget, ones that have been hurt really badly and ones that are doing better than expected. So on the far left, you see the parking, the first one, and then the net hotel tax, the third one in from the left, which we just explained. Property taxes is largely personal property tax. Personal property tax is a tax on business equipment, and as we've had businesses shut down, we're seeing fewer receipts in that source. The good news on the far right-hand side, what has been a pleasant surprise for us is recordation and transfer taxes are projected 24.2 million over the adopted budget. And the reason for that is that recordation and transfer, we expected a disruption, frankly, in those receipts due to COVID. And what has actually played out is that there was a short month or two disruption in the market with people, agents trying to figure out how to show homes and buyers getting back into the market and being able to do things safely and virtually. But what we've seen since then is we've seen really dynamic activity, especially on the residential side. So the numbers we're seeing are the highest in over a decade in terms of the number of transactions per month and the value of the transactions that we're seeing close. There's two, I think, primary reasons for that. One is, again, we have really low, still continue to have rock bottom interest rates, which lures people into the market. We also, one theory that we've seen talked about nationally and locally is that as people realize that they'll be working from home potentially more permanently, some people have been seeking to upgrade their space or move to larger homes. I'll mention to the right there too, just to the left of that, the second one in from the right, camera violations have been better than expected. That is because in the early days of the pandemic, in the early months of fiscal 21, when there was not a lot of traffic, we saw a lot more violations with less people on the roads. People were speeding more often and going through red lights more often. That has tapered off a little bit as traffic has gotten back to more normal levels. But we expected, we were wrong on this one. We expected there with less people on the roads that we would have less violations just because on a volume basis there were less people out there. But it turns out even with that lower number of people on the roads, we had more violations. And then the next two, highway user revenues and income taxes, are two that we've been fortunate have been largely unaffected so far. Not completely unaffected, but it seems like there's been just short disruptions in both of those sources. So both of those are slightly above budget for fiscal 21. But again, the net of revenue overall in the general fund is we're projecting us to fall short by $20 million versus the adopted budget. Switching back over to the expenditure side of the budget. So, and the big story, of course, in fiscal 21 is what's going on with federal aid. So just first a reminder on the federal aid, the chronology. So you have the CARES Act, which was passed back in March of 2020. That was a direct aid of $103 million to the city. There was a bill called the Consolidated Appropriations Act that was passed at the end of December 2020. That one provided additional funds for rental relief, and it also extended the deadline for the CARES Act to the end of calendar year 2021. And then finally, the ARPA, American Rescue Plan, that was passed in March of 2021. It is law now. We will get $641.2 million of direct aid. That's a little bit lower than the original estimates. Reason for that is that the U.S. Treasury, when they're doing their allocations, has rerun the numbers through the more current formulas, and the city did come out on the short end of that calculation. So they ran the most current population counts, and we did lose a little bit of direct aid there. For that bucket of money, of course, we'll talk more next week about process and rules and eligibility and all of that. There's a separate hearing for that scheduled for next week. And so in terms of how we can use this money, the CARES Act, there's no match requirement, whereas FEMA, we're getting currently 100% federal support for that program. For eligible programs, it will move to 75-25 split after September 30th. And then ARPA, of course, there's no match requirement. The deadlines, our CARES is, as I mentioned, December 31st, 2021. FEMA can close their aid at any time, and then ARPA is till 2024. And then the eligibility rules are a little bit different for all of them, but generally ARPA is much more flexible than CARES originally, whereas FEMA is very specific that it has to be for the purpose of containing the emergency, the COVID-19 emergency. And so I want to run through what we're using in fiscal 21. We're using $57.6 million of CARES Act money in fiscal 21. We've saved $24.5 million for fiscal 22, which is budgeted in fiscal 22 for the first 6 months of the fiscal year to cover costs, continuing pandemic costs, mainly PPE, cleaning and decontamination services, and some direct personnel that will still be working on the pandemic. I've listed here for your reference all the stuff that we spent CARES Act dollars on. Most of that was decided actually last fall in the previous administration. So most of that money went out the door early in the program. And really what we've been incurring over the last couple of months is just those safety costs for city agencies, that PPE, the cleaning and things of that sort. On the FEMA side, so as I've shared with the council and publicly before, we are seeking FEMA reimbursement for certain programs. You can see the 4 that are listed in the top left. We do expect to have $34.1 million received by the end of the fiscal year. I did see some discussion in the news today about the city not acting on FEMA, which I kind of find a little bit mystifying. We've been very aggressively going after FEMA, and we do expect to receive about $34 million before the end of this year, and there will be more coming in, we think, after the end of the fiscal year. The things that are reimbursable, you can see EMS services, our food distribution program, we got approved by FEMA, so we're waiting the checks for that. On the isolation and shelter, we've got approved for the Lord Baltimore Hotel, and the other hotels are in progress. And then the vaccination sites, we got some upfront money for the programs that we've set up. So if there is any impression that we haven't been aggressive about this, I don't know where that came from, but we have been super aggressive about going after these funds, and we feel like it's good news that FEMA has obligated some of these funds already, which means we will receive the check. As I mentioned, the federal support will go from 100% down to 75-25 after September 30th, 2021. So we will have some, decisions to make on what we do with those programs and how long we support them. And then for ARPA, we have $51 million we expect to use in fiscal 21. And this is basically just the remaining dollars that we need to get to balance. And I first want to mention the revenue, what I would call the revenue loss protection or provision in the ARPA rules. ARPA basically says a city can replace public sector lost revenue if it's used to provide or maintain public services. So if we fall short of our budgeted estimates like we are expected to do in 21, we are allowed to use ARPA money to close that gap. The U.S. Treasury has you do a calculation to look at what your pre-pandemic revenue trend was versus the actual receipts. And we have run that math, and the gap that they're showing for us is over $200 million. So we are well within our eligibility to use ARPA funds to close fiscal 21. We also did have hazard pay for frontline employees in fiscal 21. That is also an eligible use of ARPA. But either way, what we're projecting here is we'll use a total of 51 million, and we can either count that all against revenue loss, or we can count that we did some additional hazard pay for employees in fiscal 21. So putting all those pieces together again, just to summarize, general fund revenue down even beyond our pessimistic estimates going into 21. Without any federal aid, we would have wiped out our entire rainy day fund in 1 year. And I'm going to dwell on that again. Without federal aid, we would have wiped out our entire rainy day fund, which we had spent 20 years building up the balance for in 1 year. And so I think it just, want to emphasize how important it is for us to have reserves. Even coming into this year, remember, ARPA was not an inevitability either. Even just last fall, with the presidential election and national elections, it was not a guarantee that we would have a more sympathetic occupant of city plight in the White House, or a split Senate that allowed them to get that bill passed. So ARPA was not guaranteed. But of course, with all that together, with federal aid from CARES, FEMA, and now ARPA, we think that most COVID-related spending and other outages or other shortfalls will be able to be covered through the end of fiscal 21. And, ARPA funds will still be needed to close the general fund imbalance, and we will need to trigger that revenue loss provision and report that we've used some of the money for that purpose. Our intent is not to, we would like to use as little of ARPA on these type of budget stabilization exercises as we possibly can. But the more we spend in this regard, the less we'll ultimately have, unfortunately, for projects going forward. That is all for me on the third quarter. I'm happy to pause here and take questions from members of the committee.
Thanks, Bob. Can you take the presentation down, please?
Sure.
Thank you. Committee members, any questions? Colleagues? Anyone? Councilwoman Ramos?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not on the committee. I hope it's okay to ask a question now.
You are more than welcome to ask questions. Yep. Go
Thank
right
you.
ahead.
So, Mr. Senemy, you had put up a slide about the various revenue sources. That was primarily the sources that you thought would be interrupted, right? Because I saw that there was the little piece of property taxes, but that was business taxes and not actual property taxes, correct?
Yeah, that was personal property taxes, which is levied on businesses. That was not real property taxes, which is levied on, real property for both residences and businesses.
Right. So the shortfalls were really in some of the things that were impacted by COVID, and not necessarily, because I don't think real property taxes were impacted. Right.
Well, I think I wouldn't say they weren't impacted. It's more the timing. So with real estate taxes this year, a lot of our payments were made. Generally fall earlier in the year. In July the bills go out. So we didn't see much of an impact on collection right away. Now we know there's a lot of kind of backlogs in the housing system, right, with like rental payments, and which flows through into people paying taxes. We're not sure yet how that exactly will play out through the end of this year. We did have the tax sale, of course, a few weeks ago, where we excluded certain people to protect them, which we think was a good move given the circumstances. But in the long term, I would say I'm more concerned about commercial real estate values will be impacted. They weren't impacted in fiscal 21, but they were impacted in fiscal 22, and it's very likely they will be impacted in fiscal 23 as the next wave of assessments comes through. As I'm sure folks know, property tax assessments are done over a 3-year period, so you get a third of your property tax base gets reassessed every each year. And so we saw an impact on commercial in 22, and the central business district will be reassessed in fiscal 23. So I think we're going to see a lagging impact on property tax assessments, especially on the commercial side, but we didn't see that hit so far in 21.
Thank you. Can I ask a follow-up, Mr. Chair?
Yes, ma'am.
Thanks. You had mentioned that eventually FEMA will be 75-25.
Right.
Let me just say that I think the risk that the city took to spend money ahead to protect so many people from COVID by housing them in hotels and other protections and getting the food out was the right move. It's lucky that we were able to get FEMA, but I'm really glad the city did it. And obviously we would have tried to, work things out. But now with the FEMA only being 75-25, it sounds like we're going to have to make some hard decisions soon. And what's going to be the sort of over under on that, the risk, because it's going to be totally unacceptable to get these people who are in hotels to be back out on the street. So what are those calculations going to look like? And I guess this is a question that I can ask MOHS later as well.
Yeah, I would defer to them on the health and the risk and items, but I would just say financially, one of the strange things about the ARPA funds is that the rules say that you cannot use it as a match for other federal programs, which is odd. So if you remember before we got 100% FEMA support, which only happened with the Biden administration making that order. Before, when it was 75-25, ultimately local governments put enough pressure on the Treasury and the feds that they allowed you to use CARES as a match for FEMA. But the current rules for ARPA say you can't use ARPA to fill in the gap for other federal reimbursement, like on FEMA. So what that means is that if we continue that program beyond September, there's going to be 25% of the cost is just going to fall to the general fund, and we're not funded to do that. So that's the financial consideration. The other thing is that, remember, FEMA can also pull the plug on that program at any time. So once they feel like the pandemic has been controlled, because FEMA only supports emergency expenses insofar as it's required to control the emergency, in this case being, of course, COVID-19. So, they've been very clear when we've made our applications, you have to prove that you're doing that in order to control the pandemic, which of course it's doing. We're spreading people out and making it safer, but it's not just kind of like a blanket social, program or social service program. So there will be hard decisions to make on that. The financials will be part of it. The health and the risk will be the other part of it. But I can't say we've had a deep discussion about this yet internally, but our senior team and folks are aware that is coming.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Colleagues, any other questions?
Yes,
Council Vice President?
thank you, Mr. Chair. I know that at the beginning you had talked a little bit about the parking and the fines, the garage, all those things in play. And we know that the Parking Authority Board oversees, a number of those collections. As we move into, reopenings and visitors start using the garages, people start going back to work, do you anticipate an uptick on collecting all those things? We have people that register for the residential parking permits. I think we're behind on all of that stuff. Really, just collections in general.
Yeah.
Can you just elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, sure. So we do expect the receipts to pick up, and we're already seeing some, limited evidence even in the last couple months that slowly, as we restart, that some of that activity will pick up. So some of it will be just the general climate, business climate. People feel more comfortable coming down, and going out to eat or going to a movie or whatever, coming downtown. One thing to mention too is that the part of the issue here is that the city chose, I think correctly, but we did choose to waive certain enforcement actions as well. So for example, we weren't doing, and still I don't believe are doing, street sweeping in the neighborhoods. And the parking enforcement officers, they go right in front of that, right? If anybody's ever lived in one of those neighborhoods and the sign says 8 o'clock, they're there at 8 o'clock to make sure they issue tickets to get folks off the street. So when we waived that, a lot of the enforcement revenue, I shouldn't say a lot, but some of the enforcement revenue comes from actions like that. So we've been, I think, deferential to our residents and make sure that we weren't doing over enforcement during a time when a lot of people were going to be home. So some of it will come from, as we waive those things and start going back to more normal environment, some of that enforcement will pick up. And then also, more people coming into the downtown area will pick up the volume as well. I think, in my next presentation, you'll see that parking, we do have forecast an increase in 22, but I'm skeptical that we'll ever get back to pre-COVID numbers. I think there will be, if there are people that permanently do, work from home, we're not going to see those private garages or our garages as filled as we're used to. And so I think we'll do better, but I doubt we'll get back to those gross numbers that I showed you here pre-COVID. And that's a problem. That's a problem. That's a hurt for the city in the long run, and it'll make it harder for us to recover.
Thank you.
Sure.
Colleagues, any other questions? Okay, we're now going to go into recess, and we will pick up Council Bill 21-0080, the ordinance of estimates for the fiscal year ending June 30, 2022. Bob, if you could please take it away.
Okay, so I'm going to pull open a different PowerPoint for this one, and let me know when you can see it. I don't have the share function again, so if somebody could, Marguerite or somebody from Council Services could turn that
Can
on.
you give Bob sharing privileges? Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Can folks see that? Should see the fiscal 22 budget briefing. Okay, can folks see that?
Yes, they could see it.
Okay, so
Mhm.
next presentation is on the fiscal 22 budget. And agenda for this discussion is first, wanted to talk about the general fund outlook, both on the revenue and expenditure side for fiscal 22, the year beginning July 1st. I'll go through some of the key budget recommendations, starting with ways we expect to continue to use federal aid into fiscal 22, and then we'll go through each of the key priorities, youth, public safety, clean and healthy, equitable development, and stewardship of city resources. And then I'll also touch on some of our other fund sources, casino funds, grants, utility funds, and the capital budget. I should mention right up front, this is meant to be a very high level overview. You know, we have a full week next week and into the following week where many of the city agencies will come in to answer more detailed questions about the budget. So I will try to answer what I can here if there are questions about agency budgets, but some of them we might have to defer to those agency specific hearings. So first off, highlights on the budget as a whole. This budget is very important, is that we were able to maintain, we're very proud that we've been able to maintain, you know, all of our city services. There are no across the board cuts like there were in the fiscal 21 budget. We're actually even starting to think about being able to slowly restore a handful of things that were eliminated in the fiscal 21 budget, one being graffiti removal, where we've added back 2 crews. We're maintaining our base property tax rate at $2.24 per $100 of assessed value. We're also preserving the 20 cents by 2020 initiative. So we have reached that 20-cent target now. We reached it in 2020, and we're maintaining those reductions for residential owner-occupied properties. We're utilizing CARES and FEMA aid to support our continuing COVID-19 response, which I'll touch on again in a moment. We're leveraging some city funds in the housing department to get access to some state weatherization resources, and we think we'll be able to do up to 500 more home projects with those funds. And we're also continuing the implementation of the enterprise resource planning system. We're through, you know, mostly through with phase 1. We know there was a lot of hiccups on the payroll implementation, but we think we're past those now and looking ahead to the next phase, which is the general ledger financial accounting system. So just talking about the general fund as a whole and echoing some of the points from the third quarter hearing. Overall, I think what we're seeing so far is that the local recovery is likely to lag a bit behind national and global and even state indicators. The reason for that is that urban areas just got hit a lot harder with COVID. When you look at the stories from around the United States, you know, big cities like the New Yorks, Los Angeles of the world, of the country, got hit really hard by this. And Baltimore is much closer to those types of cities than it is to more rural or suburban states or jurisdictions. Because of that, we believe that general fund recurring revenue sources are only going to grow about $22.9 million in fiscal 22. And again, some of that is the recovery of things we just talked about, parking, hotel, but it's a slow recovery, and that 1.2% growth is just not nearly enough to cover on a going basis the increased cost of our services. We are seeing some resiliency in certain general fund revenue sources. So we mentioned earlier, transfer and recreation activity has been strong, and income tax largely has been not entirely unaffected, but largely unaffected so far. Commercial property assessments are a concern, as we mentioned earlier. Only 0.9% growth on Group 3 city properties, which is the southern part of the city. And then Group 1 properties, the Central Business District, are due for reassessment in fiscal 2023. And then again, those sources that were hit really bad. So parking revenues and hotel tax are still projected well below their pre-COVID average. And again, just another visual of hotel tax that, you know, only less than a million per month over the past almost year. And same with parking revenue. In 21, we're actually underwater. meaning that we don't really net any parking revenues into the general fund. It's actually the opposite for 21 for the moment that the general fund is subsidizing parking activity. In 22, you'll see there is that rebound, so we'll get back into positive territory, but again, not nearly back to where we were pre-COVID. I wanted to mention the budget process as we move to the expenditure side. Our focus was mainly on how do we just maintain critical city services during this emergency, given the financial emergency. I would admit and acknowledge this wasn't as maybe as a strategic as a budget as we would have hoped to have in terms of comparing city services and trying to figure out the best way to improve outcomes. But we felt like our role this year was to make sure we were using making the best use of federal aid to continue our pandemic response primarily and make sure that we could maintain city services into 2022, which I think we've achieved. On the fixed cost front, you will notice that in some agency budgets that there were increases for both pension cost and active employee healthcare costs. On the pension, our costs grew by $15 million overall, or 6.1%, and that was partially because we had lower than expected returns in the pension funds in terms of investments in fiscal 2020, which leads to higher city contributions 2 years later. Our active health care cost will grow in fiscal 22, but retiree healthcare costs, there's a net savings of $10 million. We moved our retirees January 1st of 2021 to Medicare Advantage plans, and we'll now see a full year of savings from that move in fiscal 22. The good news is that savings on the retiree health side especially means that our fixed costs now represent only 40.6% of our general fund revenue. So in visual terms, that lighter green line in the middle is how much of our general fund budget is consumed by what we would call fixed costs. And you can see that in 22, largely because of those savings from the retiree benefits, it's even to help offset some of those higher pension costs. And we're at a better point there than we've been for many years. In terms of the recommendations by each of the outcomes, first, just by the numbers, this is a reference for folks. You can see this data in our executive summary budget book. The operating plan is up $829 million, but remember, over $600 million of that is the ARPA funds that are in the federal budget for fiscal 22. Looking below at the general fund budget, the growth is 4.4%, but remember, only 1.2% of that is from recurring general fund revenue sources. The other 50 million or so is coming from federal aid that we're using for the budget at large because we can support some of those COVID response costs, which we'll touch on next. So use of federal aid in the 2022 budget, we're using a total of 24.5 million of CARES that's left after we get to the end of fiscal 21. About 8 million of it will go to direct personnel. The law allows personnel that are substantially dedicated, quote, substantially dedicated to the response, can be charged to CARES. And so we do have people in EMS and health that we can charge against CARES. There's also, we expect another $16 million of costs through the end of December for those immediate response costs. So things like cleaning and PPE and technology upgrades will still be required for us to be safe in city buildings in fiscal 22. And again, remember that reminder that the aid ends at the end of December. So we will have to wind down those costs as well and make sure, hopefully they're gone by the end of December if we can get through the pandemic. On the FEMA side, we budgeted for a half year worth of FEMA reimbursement for the programs we had. That was before we learned when the ordinance was submitted, we did not know that the coverage would go from 100% to 75-25. So we budgeted to be safe a full a half year worth of FEMA coverage for these costs. But again, the decision to continue these will be, partially financial and partially based on the health risk. We're doing for FEMA funds support, as we mentioned earlier, the food and shelter programs. They also support some of the health programs, including the mass vaccination sites. And then the 22 budget does include a bunch of other funding sources for rental relief. So if you remember, we spent $10 million of CARES Act money early in the pandemic to handle eviction prevention, to get the first wave of eviction prevention dollars out the door. But we have additional sources, as you can see here: CDBG, ESG, some local from the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and $17.7 million from what's called the Consolidated Appropriations Act, Emergency Rental Assistance, what they call ERA 1. There's also in the ARPA funds, ERA 2. So there's more money coming to us that's not appropriated yet here for rental relief. So we feel like that program, we have the funds to support a program for months, if not over a year. And we'll discuss that at the hearing with the Mayor's Office of Children and Family Success, who's the lead on all of those programs. In terms of the ARPA, like we said, $641 million. We've got to spend it by the end of December in 2024. We'll have a separate hearing to go into more detail on the rules, but at a high level, the only allowable uses are to respond to the COVID-19 emergency or its negative economic impacts. As mentioned earlier, we need to use some of the money for budget stabilization, and we will likely need some funds to close fiscal 21 in balance. But the more that we can stabilize our own budget, the more we'll have for project spending. At this point, we're estimating $500 million is the goal to use as project spending. In terms of the base budget, going through service by or outcome by outcome, some of the key highlights. So in the youth, prioritizing youth services, we'll have $360.3 million of support for city schools this year. That's everything. That's MOE, that's retiree benefits, school construction, and school health and crossing guard services. Kerwin, additional contributions from the city due to the Kerwin Commission law, which passed in this General Assembly session, is not due to start until fiscal 23. So reason for that is that the bill that was passed, if you remember, in the prior General Assembly session was vetoed by the governor. General Assembly overrode that veto, but then added a law called Kerwin 2.0, and the big impact for us is that it just pushed the first year contribution back to 2023. That first year contribution is going to be a big challenge for the city. The first year, our estimates that we've seen are around a $60 million additional contribution for the city will be required. And then on the library services, they're fully funded this year to get back to both a safe reopening and to continue some of the digital services that they had emphasized during COVID-19. On public safety, two key highlights. One, the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement, that's the old, what we used to call Office of Criminal Justice, is leveraging private money to kick off and to restart the group violence reduction strategy. This is what you might remember as what we've called in the past focused deterrence or Operation Ceasefire. This administration feels strongly that this is a very valuable program and can be a tool in helping us reduce violence in Baltimore City. So we have some private investment already lined up, and this strategy will kick off and get started in fiscal 22. The 911 fee is also, we were proposing to increase the fee by 25 cents this year. There was already a separate hearing about that that we introduced in concurrently with this budget. The reason for that increase in the fee is that our 911 services have grown, the cost has grown more quickly than the revenues from the fee. And the recent bill in 2019 in the General Assembly, what they call the Next Generation 911 bill, it allowed local governments to go back and raise the fee to keep up with those increased costs. We are not the only jurisdiction. Our bill response, if you're interested in that, does mention that there are some other jurisdictions that are raising their fee at the same time as we are. I should say, we don't mention the police budget here, but because it's always a hot topic, I want to mention it here. There's really not any additional police service investments in the fiscal 22 budget. I know that the pure dollar amount of the police budget did grow in the general fund by over $20 million. The reason for that is three things. One is the pension cost growth, which I mentioned earlier. Two is growth in workers' compensation costs, which is based on an assessment of their recent injury and claims history, as well as the exposure that our frontline employees have during COVID. And the third thing is the active employee health benefit costs that are growing, not just in the police budget, but across the board in most agency budgets. So I know it's been an issue, and we did hear it come up at the Board of Estimates taxpayer night, but I want to be clear that there's really no new police service investments this year. There's not more personnel or not new units or anything like that. It's basically a current services budget with growth in those fixed costs. In clean and healthy communities, we're continuing the SOS program. That's the one in DPW where if there is a sewage backup that's not the fault of the resident, that DPW provides professional cleaning and disposal services for those issues. And then we will start the rollout of recycling cans in fiscal 22. This program, it was previously announced. Some of the funding is in the 22 budget. It's an $8.3 million upfront program that we can fund with Stormwater Enterprise fund balance. We got some private grants. We also got an interest-free loan that will be paid back through the Stormwater Enterprise Fund. In equitable neighborhood development, two quick things in MOED. MOED is distributes a lot of federal dollars for workforce development. They are working on a program now to try to better standardize their access points during COVID-19 to make sure we get folks to the right center or the right needs. And they're also working with the health department to figure out how we can take some of the temporary staff that have been on during COVID-19, folks like contact tracers, for example, and try to connect them to either city jobs or other jobs in the city once that need goes away. And then finally on stewardship of city resources, two highlights: the digital equity coordinator who is on now. We raised $200,000 of grant support for that position. That role will be heavily focused on figuring out how to bring internet access to Baltimore households that don't currently have it. And we're also providing a $200,000 loan to BCIT to invest in what we're calling automated online messaging technology. So think of that as like if you do any online shopping, sometimes you have that chat will pop up where they will say, how can I help you, or how can I assist, or if you have a question. We'd like to do the same thing for our 311 service. BCIT has made a good case that most of our 311 service requests come from only 4 or 5 SRs, and that if we can instruct people how to do those things online, that would reduce the pressure on the 311 call center. Finally, with other fund sources, and again, we'll go into much more detail about some of these next week at the appropriate agency hearing. But just generally, casino revenues, not surprisingly, bounce back expected in fiscal 22. 21, we had the casinos either closed or at partial capacity. The horseshoe ground lease and the parking garage both support the general fund at large. The table games revenue goes directly to school construction for the 21st Century Schools program. And then the other funds, the impact aid around that comes from the Horseshoe Casino and around the Pimlico racetrack, goes to just services within the radius of those two facilities. Grant funding, I wanted to list a few highlights. Even though the focus has been on federal aid due to COVID, there are still a lot of grants in the city budget that we get on more of a continuing basis. I've listed a couple here in both the state and the federal and special funds. There's more detail about this in each of the chapters in the agency detail. So if you see federal funds or state funds, you should ask about it. Even within those buckets of federal state funds, within some of our larger agencies, health and MOED and homeless services, sometimes there can be multiple grants. So there's more detail about that in the agency detail book, but feel free to dig in on those at the hearing as well. I would just call your attention at the bottom to, very important priorities of the mayor, the group violence reduction strategy and the broadband and digital equity, both accomplished for now, at least for the first year with private fundraising. The utility funds for fiscal 22, this includes an already Board of Estimates passed rate increase that's due on to go into effect on July 1st. It's about a 9% increase across the utilities. And so, we can talk in more detail about that at the Public Works hearing, of course. And then the capital budget, there will be a separate hearing on the first day just about the capital budget, which planning will be present at to answer any questions. And just at a high level, you'll notice that the pay-as-you-go funding in the general fund is up $14.5 million. We had to cut almost all of that in fiscal 21 due to COVID. So we're back up to a $15 million investment just out of our general fund resources. The conduit enterprise fund is a decline because they had to front load projects in 21 to meet the terms of our agreement with BGE. And then revenue bonds, you'll notice below $252 million decline, and also that other category, which is grants to other jurisdictions through our utility, is down because we are not expected to go to market for as much borrowing this year. The capital budget generally goes in waves every 2 or 3 years, where we do a big round of borrowing and then we spend that down and only need supplemental resources from the private bond market. I've listed here just some highlights of the capital budget: IT, city buildings, school buildings, recreation and parks, transportation infrastructure. I won't go into all of the nitty-gritty detail there. And then, things like solid waste facilities, housing projects, economic development, and water, wastewater and stormwater infrastructure. There's a lot of great detail in the planning department's documents. You can actually go on a project-by-project basis and see what's funded in the 22 budget. So if there are questions on that, you can definitely bring those to the planning capital budget overview hearing, which I believe is scheduled for next Tuesday. So that is the 22 budget in a nutshell, and I'm happy to pause here and take any questions from the committee members.
Thank you, Bob. If you could take the presentation down, please.
Sure.
Colleagues, we're just going to start, go in order by district for the committee. We'll start with Councilwoman McCray. Any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My questions were answered in the presentation.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Councilman Dorsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm fine.
All right. Councilman Schleifer.
I'm good. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councilwoman Middleton.
No questions. I'm just, thank you, Bob. I'm excited to see money going towards that new office of neighborhoods and engagement, to really trying to get them kicked off. I know they have the Safe Streets program within that office, and just other things, and it's just very important. I also know that our constituents are, the SOS program and just things like that, the needs of our constituents and them speaking out for different things is just very important at this time. So just really appreciate your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. At this rate, I'm inclined to just look into if we can cancel budget week. We'll jump to Councilman Burnett.
The question I had was around the water bill, the proposed rate increase. Has there been any clarification? The federal resources can be used to fill that gap in lieu of an increase to the residents?
I'm sorry, Councilman, you cut out for just a moment. Could you repeat the first part? I'm sorry.
Is it an allowable use of any of the new federal resources? Could that money go towards filling that gap that the rate increase would be seeking to fill?
Yeah, it's a little bit unclear at the moment because one of the provisions of the law says that you can't do it to cut taxes. Although so in other words, you can't use the money to make a reduction in the rate. Although with water utility, it's a little bit different because it's a fee. So I would say it's unclear at this point, but I'll follow up with that and see if we can get you an answer on that. And I would encourage you to come, Councilman, to the hearing on ARPA specifically, because we'll go into a lot more detail on all the rules. But in in that particular realm, there is a little bit of fuzziness whether you're supposed to be using it to help people that have been affected by COVID-19, but it's also saying you can't cut taxes or what we might think of as rate. So it's a little bit unclear at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councilman Stokes?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one question on the homelessness in the city. I know that we all experience that throughout the city, throughout the country, and I see Mayor Scott has been kind of moving that a lot of homeless into the hotels, and I know you're talking about purchasing the hotels, but over in my district, we are actually building a 54-unit in partnership with healthcare for the homeless. So will we be seeing some more money, not just in terms of, I've always used the homeless issue as a check-it game, with either chess, wherever we get moving, we put them there. And my issue been, how do we now, like we doing over in the Oliver community, find a permanent housing for those persons and using healthcare for the homeless, who've been a great partner. Are we now going to allocate more money to look at more permanent housing for homelessness here in the city instead of playing a chess game?
Yeah, so I would say the FEMA money we acknowledge is temporary because it will expire at some point. I know that the idea of purchasing a hotel or purchasing a building with ARPA funds, it is under consideration. That's one that is at the top of our list. So can't promise anything on that front, but we are considering how we can use ARPA funds to do that and to accomplish that on some scale.
Real quick, if you don't know, Mr. Chair, I just got a follow up. So we're not going to use none of the money from the general fund, not just the FEMA money, because that's temporary money. So we're going to be looking at some more money and saying, maybe look at some projects like we're doing in Oliver to make sure there's some funding there for other parts of the district. I can't speak for other council people, but we all deal with the homeless here in the city. So are we looking at having some more money into the budget? So if there's some other locations where we can really help the homeless here in the city to have permanent housing, will there be money in the budget? So if that ever pops up, we just can't say it's temporary FEMA money, but there's money there from the general fund.
Yeah, there is general fund money for temporary sheltering. So and there always is in each year's budget. With the hotels, we moved some of the people out of those shelters to make more room at those shelters and to get certain people isolated. So in terms of if we're evaluating other sites, I don't know offhand, but I think that would be a good question for the MOHS hearing next week. But there is still money for temporary sheltering contracts. It's just those shelters are not as filled now due to COVID because of what we were able to do with temporary FEMA aid.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Bullock?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. This question really goes back to the earlier portion of your presentation. So you did mention how the tax revenue from recordation and transfer actually was increased. We know, I know Councilwoman Ram was thinking about it too. We know that's the main funding source for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. So I know we can address that issue as it relates to housing, but are any points you want to make regarding that fund at this point?
So I think with the recordation and transfer revenue, we have seen, the trend we're seeing in the general transfer recordation. We've also seen some improvement in the receipts for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. I mean, that one, transfer and recordation for the general fund is very hard to predict because it's based on the market. And the AHTF money is even harder to predict because it's only those handful of really high value transactions. But the trend has been better for that revenue that we've seen over the past couple of months, that we've gotten more receipts and more of those larger transactions. Only thing I would caution is, we've seen that revenue source can dry up very quickly. If we look back at trends in the last kind of run up in the housing market, thinking back to kind of 2002, 2003, you saw us go from 100 million of receipts to down to 40 in less than a year. And so that can really dry up quickly if you have like a disruption like we had a decade ago, a real estate market crash. So you do see some kind of concerns out there that maybe there's a little bit too much kind of run up in housing values, but we'll take it now. It really has helped kind of close the gap in some of our other areas. We try not to, when we build our budget in the general fund for that, we try to be very conservative intentionally, because we know that those funds can dry up, and we have seen them dry up very quickly.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Councilman Conway. Councilman Conway. Councilwoman Ramos.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have a question and a statement, if that's okay. I appreciated the briefing the other day, so we got a head start for those of us who are new to the council. I just wanted to, I think it would be helpful for my colleagues to also know that you had explained to me that you're using ARPA, you're trying to use ARPA money to be able to fill the predicted gap in revenues, to be able to keep city services going in the next couple of years, right? And then we've got Kerwin coming, that extra 60 million. But so is the ARPA also going to be used for that? I think when we talked, you were trying to figure it all out at the time, how that's going to work, because we're going to need to figure out how to make sure that our services are ready, but also that we're going to have to pay for Kerwin, and is that sort of budget on the outside using ARPA to help us in the out years, including your calculation with Kerwin?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. So what we know at this point on terms of our longer term outlook, so that you can use the money to kind of close the gap, so to speak, for revenue loss. And as I mentioned earlier, we've calculated what that is, so we're well within that framework. With Kerwin coming, as a mandated expense, basically, that's part of our kind of service delivery. We do believe that we would be able to use some ARPA funds to cover that cost. The issue, of course, is that's a recurring cost and it's growing every year. So we've got to be really careful about that. We will, of course, talk about this, with Mayor and his team, after this budget season is over, as we start planning for fiscal 23, about how we want to approach that. Because the fear, the ARPA in my mind it's good news, and it's also kind of bad news, is that you can do a lot of really great one-time transformational things with it, but we've got to be really careful that we don't do things that have a recurring cost that just falls back on the city when the money runs out. So when we made our projection looking at how much to set aside for budget stabilization, yes, we did build in that over the next couple of years there will be this additional mandated cost. But it's not my belief that we should cover all of it with ARPA funds, because we'll leave ourselves hanging at the end when that money runs out. But it will be a consideration. I mean, it is a big new mandated cost, and we do have this funding available. So we'll have to put those pieces together on fiscal 23. But I can be sure that fiscal 23 is going to be one of the hardest years we've had here in many years. It might even be harder than fiscal 21, because when we were planning for Kerwin, a lot of the things we threw overboard in fiscal 21, we were kind of not saving those necessarily, but I kind of had in the back of my mind, I've got $30-40 million that I can count on. I don't have that anymore. A lot of that stuff we had to throw overboard just to balance 21. And as you saw, some of the things we threw overboard, caused some problems like graffiti removal. There was a lot of pressure and I think in a good way to say like, wait, we need something, we need to have some crew available. We can't just write that off completely. So we did have some pre-planning for Kerwin that dated back to the last administration. We used a lot of those ideas. Yes, we're aware that the stabilization funds could be used for Kerwin, but I don't think that would be in the best long-term interest of the city to just use it for that purpose.
Thank you. And I just wanted to sort of, first of all, thank you for the great presentation, very thorough. I really appreciate it. It was a great overview to then get into the thick of the big books here. So I appreciate that. But I just want to emphasize again to you and the team and to the mayor's office that one of the categories in terms of priorities was neighborhood equitable development. In the general practice in community development, equitable development is actually investing in communities that have traditionally not been invested in. And that's not what the indicator says in this budget. So I'm really hoping in future budgets, as we rethink how we're doing things, that and we're really using equity in our, over everything, that we're actually talking about, and this goes with what my colleague said, Councilman Stokes, really thinking about how we're going to do those investments and using that term equitable development properly in our budgeting. So that's more of a statement to you and to the mayor's office and to all of us.
Appreciate that point. And as I've shared, I think with you, we haven't taken we admittedly didn't take a good look at those indicators this year because we were so focused on COVID and federal aid, but I think that's a fair point. We will look at that going forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Colleagues, any other questions? All right, Bob, I'm going to hold my questions for next week. Want to thank you and your team for all the hard work that's gone into putting this budget together. All the briefings over the past month, making yourselves available for our colleagues. Really appreciate it very much, and looking forward to seeing you bright and early on Tuesday morning. And I know we'll see you in a little bit at Taxpayers Night.
That's right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.